Wish we could open windows. It'd be perfect, wasn't it? If we had them. Well, we have a small adult class. Well, it's a mixed class today. We have adults and some on the way to being adults very soon. They will be before you know it. And the class today has to do with our family relationships. It's good to see Jonathan here and the kids, and we're glad he's able to see Sister Jane and his grandparents. I know they appreciate that. On his way to Florida, I think, where his wife is. I've got kids in Florida. You've got kids on the way to Florida today, I think. So we hope that Florida's good to all of them. Yeah, that'll help Florida too. It's already got a pretty good governor, but that'll help a lot more to have good Christians. Well, we're going to go into our book on page 88 today and try to finish up our lesson about the command to honor father and mother. What we're doing is looking at do's and don'ts for the Christians in general. This is an ancient book. Ancient, I say. It goes way back to the 50s. And it's still timeless. And I think it's even more to the point today than it has ever been. Okay. Well, these are pretty easy. What I often do, and I'll have to confess this, we'll read a point and then I'll go off everywhere. So sometimes the book's almost irrelevant. We'll use, and she puts the passages up that I talk about, so they'll all be up there. You'll have that available as well. We're living in a world where there are many challenges to Christianity. That has always been true. From the moment it was born, the faith of Jesus Christ, the moment it came into the world, it was under attack by the man's mortal enemy, Satan, and his minions. Those are the people who work for Satan. Most of the time, unbeknownst to them, that they're doing Satan's work. It's not because they have a direct line into his place, hell, where he calls them up and says, hey, I want you to do so and so. It's because Satan uses temptations and he throws before so many humans these opportunities, these delightful things to do. And they interpret them as ways to be happy, ways to be secure. They interpret them as good things, but they interpret them wrong because Satan doesn't tell the truth. He lies. So this is why he has so many foot soldiers in the world, and they're out to destroy the one thing that's right and good and holy, and that's the message that came from Jesus of Nazareth. Well, the message was anticipated in a way, you could say, by the law of Moses. It was a preparation to get Israel ready for the coming Messiah. It wouldn't have worked for Jesus to come into the world right after Adam and Eve had sinned. They weren't prepared for that. The world was not prepared for that. It took time, long, patient time on God's part. Of course, for God, 1 day is 1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day. But from our standpoint, it took a lot of human history, and it finally came. The Lord sent Jesus. So the law of Moses was a preparation, but it's still a valuable tool for us today, because most of what we call the Ten Commandments, which would be the center and the core of the law of Moses, the Old Testament, most of that has been incorporated, that is, brought over into the message of Jesus, into the New Covenant. Now there is one, and we were just studying this last 2 or 3 weeks or more, one commandment that has not been brought over per se, and that's the commandment to honor the Sabbath day, to keep the Sabbath day. Now, at the end of this, I think I'll go through the review questions in a few seconds here, a few minutes. We'll cover what that day was. I'm not going to anticipate that yet. But we learned that we're not under the Sabbath. We are today to honor the Lord's Day under the new covenant of Jesus. And we know that's today. That's the first day of the week, the Lord's Day. So on the first day of the week, we come together to worship God and to show our great love and reverence for God. Our fear of God in the proper sense of fear. Fear out of great respect. So we are here today in fulfillment of that obligation we have under the New Testament. But what do we get out of the Old? Well, quite a bit. And when we come to some of the so-called do's of the Ten Commandments, you have do's and don'ts even within the Ten Commandments themselves. We have the command to honor father and mother in Exodus 20 and verse 12. We started looking at that last time on page 87. Let's go to page 88, look at point number 5, about in the middle, the point number 5 that doesn't have a parenthesis around it, where in italics he says, here are some ways in which we can honor father and mother. So here are some ways. And does this mean these are the only ways? No. It just means these are good ways to start thinking about it. First of all, tell them. Tell them. And then show however we love them. We can show our affection in unmistakable terms. And then we can show it by our love. Love is something that proves itself. Well, where do you get that idea, Paul? 2 Corinthians 8 verse 24. Show you the proof of your love. You love me? Yes, I love you, Mama. Well, you haven't been to see me in 10 or 15 years, but I love you anyway. You love me? Yes. Well, I've got a heavy refrigerator to move, and none of the other people will do it. And you're too busy. Well, I'm working on my motorcycle today, Mom. Don't have time for that. You know what I mean? These are simple things. My own mother could challenge me about that. Well, Mom, you live a long way off. My mother lives about 500 feet from my front door. Her house is about 500 feet away. That's a pretty good way to walk when you get my age. You know what I mean? Obviously, we see that if you love somebody, you do show it. You show it because it's natural. It's just because you want to. You don't have to be coaxed into it. Well, okay, I love you. You just do it because there's a need and you do. And he discusses that here. We manifest our love by our works. Now, is that confined to the home? Well, of course not. This is one of the major points that we try to get over to our religious neighbors. We'll talk about that more later in the worship hour, Lord willing. But right now, let's just dwell on it for a second. We chide them sometimes by saying, you don't live up to the standard. You've reduced everything to mental agreement in your heart that Jesus is God's Son, but you don't really show love. Where does the love fit in? Because we have to, you have to be able to love God, to be born of God. 1 John clearly brings that out. So where's the love? Well, you show your love by doing things, by your word. I love you, Lord. Well, be baptized for the remission of sins. No, not that. No. I don't think that's necessary. But I love you, Jesus. Well, if you love me, keep my commandments. No, I'm not that. No. You see how silly it sounds? How inconsistent, of course, it is. But what about in the home? It's the same thing in the home situation. And he mentions our brother T.B. Larrymore. He was a very well-known gospel preacher in Northwest Alabama back, I think, the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th, but especially latter 19th century. His work still lives on today. If you go to Northwest Alabama, around Florence, the Tri-City areas, Muscle Shoals, all through that whole area of Northwest Alabama, all the way over to the Mississippi line, you'll find churches of Christ in abundance. There are congregations there, a lot of them. And a good number of them started as the result of the influence of Brother Larrymore and a few others who worked with him back in those days, where they actually started what's now, I guess, Heritage University. I think it used to be Mars Hill Bible School, I think. And that morphed into the university, the Bible college they have. And Brother Larrymore wrote a lot of things as well. He even was a poet. Take my withered hands in yours, children of my soul. Mother's heart is craving love. Mother's growing old. See the snows of many years crown my furrowed brow. As I've loved and petted you, love and pet me now. Of course, we know that suggests the idea of showing concern and care for her. Okay, I love you, Mother, but I don't have time to do anything. Well, when we love our children, when they were growing up, we didn't just sit around and tell them when they were like 4 and 5 years, I love you, son, I love you, daughter, and then take the car keys out, go to the beach, and leave them there to fend for themselves. We did things. We took care of them because we loved them. So it's reciprocal. We can honor parents by helping them with our substances if they're needy. Sometimes our parents are better off than we are, but not always. And there comes a time in life when people get older, they haven't worked in a long time after retirement age. There might be a few things that we can do, and we need to be aware of those, look for those things. One of the last things Jesus did before his death was make provision for the physical welfare of his mother. That's a very good point. Remember that? Right before he died, he wanted John to take care of Mary. Evidently, we can guess, I think it's a pretty good guess, that by now his earthly father, his legal father, Joseph, not his biological father, had already passed from the scene. We would guess he had already passed away. That's not recorded for us, but it's a fair assumption since somebody has to take care of her. And it makes sense that John was told to behold thy mother. Well, what do you mean? How's she my mother? Well, in the sense that you will take her in, take care of her. From that hour, the disciple took her unto his own house or home, John 19:27. So there's a manifestation of it right there. Suppose that after Jesus had died and been resurrected, and then after the 40 days of teaching and after his ascension, John got lax and said, no, lady, this is not going to last forever. You're going to have to fend for yourself, Find you a place. We'll get you somewhere. You can't stay with us. Do you think that would have happened? Can you even imagine that happening? That John would have said that to Mary after what Jesus had asked him to do? It's not even within the realm of possibility to imagine that happening. So we know that for as long as it took, or as long it was necessary, he would have watched over her needs and taken care of her. And then he mentions what I just said. I forgot that he had said this. Maybe that's where I got the idea. Parents give of themselves, flesh of their flesh, to bring their children into existence, and then sacrificially give of themselves little by little to see the new life blossom into maturity. Parents care for their children during a helpless state, and oftentimes, years later, parents become helpless and should be cared for by the children. Life has a way of balancing things. I like that statement, and that's true. Life has a way of balancing. They took care of us when we were kids, and now when they need our help, we do what we can. Another way to honor parents, number 3 on page 89, is to write them often. And we can say today, there are other ways now. Send emails or texts or call them on the phone. Call them often. What about going to see them? I think that would go without saying, if you can. I know all of our lives are sometimes busy. Many have tough schedules, and some do live a long way off. But if possible, communicate with them in some way. The poet has expressed it thus: the tender words unspoken, the letters never sent, the long-forgotten messages, the wealth of love unspent. For these some hearts are breaking, for these some loved ones wait. So show them that you care for them before it is too late. That's good. I don't know who wrote that, but it's another poet, and it could have been the same. Could have been Larry Moore. Number 4, we may also honor parents by being the men and the women we should be. Now, wait a minute. Let's think about that. Honor your parents by being good people yourself. As an individual, I'm a son. If I'm a good son, if I try to be a good citizen, I don't go out and break windows out of people's cars and steal their stereo. I don't go smoke dope or sell it on the street. I don't do things like that. I don't beat up people. I don't get involved in riots and tear up windows in the name of some political view or whatever. I try to be a good person, and I try to go to church and do what's right, and I try to follow what the Lord says in the Bible. Now, what does that have to do with honoring my mother and my daddy? Well, let's just suppose I didn't do. Suppose I was that criminal I just described. How would my mother and my father feel about it, raising a criminal? To ask it is to answer it, of course. What grief it brings to a mother and to a father to know they brought a life into the world, to see that child grow up and only get up into trouble after trouble, one event after another. Such heart-rending experiences. And it's not uncommon. That's the bad thing about it. In our world, it's just not uncommon, even in the church, sadly. Train up a child in the way he shall go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. That's a proverb. That's a general rule. And it's generally the case. Are there ever exceptions to any of the general rules? Well, since we have free will, sometimes even being raised in the best of environments, a child can go his own way. I mean, he has the freedom to do so. And the prayer is one day that child will return. My father used to mention this, and I think it was a good point. He says, train up a child in the way he shall go. When he's old, he will not depart from him. Now, when he's a teenager, he might give you grief, or when he's 20-something. But when he gets older, when he gets old, he will not depart. And that, I think that's a good point, too. They have the proper background and training to know. When they're ready to straighten up their life, they know what they're supposed to do. So he says here, in the middle of this paragraph, the history of great men may well be considered as the biography of great parents. Well, I would hope so. I hope that my children end up being much better than I am and much more successful. We must live the praises due them. For vain are all our tributes to father and mother if in our manner of living we discredit them. And last time we mentioned something about the Chinese culture typically until its corrosion by Marxist communism, a silly atheistic view brought over from Europe into China, never really fit well except for one thing. There are and have always been people in China, just as in every country, who wanted to have control over everybody else, and they found Marxism is a really helpful tool to squash everybody else's individuality and let the few elite run the country. And that's what they're doing. But if you take the Chinese culture that has been going on for a long time, even prior to the communist takeover in 1949, they generally have honored their parents in not wanting to shame them. This doesn't mean there haven't been criminals among the Chinese. Criminality is really strong, by the way, today. They don't own guns, but knife attacks are very frequent. You don't hear that from the CCP, but you hear it from people who live in China and who come home and are willing to hear, who are from our country. And they're willing to spill the beans on what's really going on. The society's falling apart. But as you would expect, under atheism as the official doctrine. But anyway, aside from that corrosive influence of communism, it's not just the Chinese, it's all cultures that respect their families. There is less criminality, because the individual child doesn't push his rights or her right. This is my right to do what I want, regardless of what my parents think. The home is under attack. I wish you had more time to discuss that. So many times we have talked about it from an historical point of view. When I say the home is under attack, I mean that in a literal way. I mean, there are people who sit around and study ideas. They open up books in libraries and spend lifetimes preparing themselves, reading and writing, lecturing, going to lectures to learn what they can do to break up our concept of what we would call the nuclear family or the traditional family. Now, what's the ideal? It's a man and a woman, and only a man and a woman, biblically. Only a man and a woman. It can only be that. It cannot be anything else. The only other possibilities are completely ruled out by biblical teaching. God made man in the beginning, male and female, man and a woman, who mutually pledge their love for one another. They're not forced into it. Even in a society where marriages were prearranged, they had to accept that arrangement. The individuals that are involved had to accept the arrangement for them. Sometimes they didn't, and they could negotiate ways out. But there's a mutual pact they make to be married for life. Man and a woman who commit themselves to one another out of love. That's got to be it. If it's a business transaction, that's not really marriage. Marriage involves a business transaction because it involves the common sharing of property. For example, that's one aspect of marriage. So it naturally involves a business side and contracts in that way. But the essence of marriage is two men, or a man and a woman who fall in love and commit to one another. They commit. And it's a real commitment. It's a formal commitment. This aspect is lost on many of our contemporaries. It's not just a fly-by-night thing. Say, hey, I like you today, and we'll get along. We'll date this week or this month, and that's where much of it comes down today. And then in a few months, hey, if it doesn't work out, we'll divorce and go our own ways. That's the flippant, nonchalant attitude. Come right in, brother, that so many have.
That's one of the first things the communists did to control their country was to teach the children to tell on their parents if they did something the communists did not want them to do. And so they worked through the children to control the parents. and to control the country that way. So they
Right.
indoctrinated the children to tell on their parents or to pimp on their parents, or however you want to put it. And anything that communists didn't want them to be doing that wasn't communist. And so that's the way they ended up controlling the country and the mind of the people.
What would that do for the family if there's no trust and your own child could betray you? If you and your wife are sitting around the dinner table and you say something, the child could go to an authority figure the next day. You could be arrested. Well, of course, it would completely erode any trust from either side. The kids are no longer trusting of the parents of the kid. Hey, I see something here that reminds me of what's going on in our culture, in our public schools in particular. This kind of thing, to a degree, is already being encouraged. Let me give you a case in point. I don't want to get into all the details, but let's just use this as just the topic, the general topic. It has to do with so-called transgenderism. We're in a bad situation. I mean, a really bad predicament, where our public schools are diametrically opposed to the will of the parents. Now, you take almost any parent, I mean, there may be a few loony exceptions out of thousands, but almost any parent, if the boy's grown, he's born a boy, he's raised a boy, and he gets to be in middle school, and all of a sudden his friends think it's cool to be a girl, the schools encourage them, don't tell your parents. When you come to school, we'll call you by your girl name, we'll call you by female pronouns and so on. You can put on a wig or whatever, or other things. It's usually the other way around. It's usually the little girls now wanting to be boys. And these are the things happening. Don't tell the parents. Then, sometimes the parents find out. And when the parents go and they complain, then the law is brought in. And like in California, there are some states, very left-wing state, where the parents really have little say in the matter anymore because the so-called experts, let me tell you about the experts in a minute. So-called experts like this guidance counselor at school or the teacher or the administration, the teachers, they decide that no, it's best for this child to make that decision. Well, the child's only 9 or maybe, let's just say 11 years old. Yeah, but he's able to make his own decision. She can make her own decision. But the child's talking about surgery that would forever alter their life. A little girl who could never have a baby when she grows up. But that's her decision. But her mother has something to say about it. No, she does not. Now, don't tell me that's not, and you won't tell me. Don't tell me that's not Marxism gone to seed in our country. And this is why there is a huge backlash and why parents are showing up at a lot of these parent-teacher meetings and a lot of these school board meetings. And this is why the Gestapo of the left wing of the United States, the Communist Party of America, its Gestapo wing that goes by the acronym FBI, is going in and threatening these parents. You're not allowed to speak because the authorities have spoken. The authorities have determined these sex changes are going to happen and you have no say in the matter. I beg to differ. But this has happened. It happened. You're talking about the Cultural Revolution in Red China that occurred in the 1960s and 70s. I believe that's when it was, the 60s and 70s, when even the communists themselves feared their own children. Even the communists were turned in by their own kids. The kids went radical. Duh. Kids were unrestrained. They kind of didn't know when to turn it off. So the kids were out humiliating all the adults, and it was a horrible time for China. Even worse than it is right now. And some of them remember those terrible days. But that is what I was saying up front. Communism is just one of the many isms, but it's one of the most powerful today since the 19th century. It's one of the many ideologies of our world that is a companion to what Satan wants done. It has the same goals and many times the same methods as Satan, its father, although it doesn't always, it's an atheistic view, so it doesn't really believe there's a Satan, and this is exactly what he wants. He's smiling all the way to the bank. When his own people who follow him don't even think he's real, then they're not going to warn about him. But he can get them to do exactly what he wants. So they do that to tear down the family. There is a concerted effort in our culture today. I mean, concerted by, like I said, people go to school all their life, get degrees in this stuff to come out and destroy the family. The family, man and woman only. No such thing as same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court got it completely wrong, and maybe it will be reversed. There have been some noises about that. Not reversed, it'll just be shown it was bogus. There's no thing in the Constitution that guarantees so-called same-sex marriage. It doesn't exist. Even as Justice Roberts said when it was first decreed that there's such a thing as same-sex marriage, even the dissenting Supreme Court justice who was against it altogether, and I have to hand that to Justice Roberts on that one, said this has never been known in the history of man. There's no culture has ever known of so-called same-sex marriage. It's just not a thing. It's not real. But they try to make it real. Man and a woman who love each other, who have mutual intent to marry, that means they've made a pact. It's a formal pact. What is a pact? P-A-C-T. What's another word?
Formal agreement.
Formal agreement.
Contract.
Contract. That's a good synonym. An older word that you'd find in the Bible would be covenant. Covenant between two people. It's formal. Now, what I'm doing is outlining the biblical ingredients for marriage that are learned by a careful study of everything in the Bible about marriage. Husband, you find the word husband, wife, family, marry, marriage, the verb or the noun. Take all of those contexts and put them together and you derive these simple elements. A man and a woman, primary, who love each other and mutually pledge to one another to be married. And if the intent is for life, that's the intent, to be married for life. And the third thing, and this is often overlooked, I was so sad in my work in the mission fields of Latin America. Some of our well-meaning missionaries, I say well-meaning, I know one in particular from another state in the South, who would go down there. He was a very successful missionary, far more than I am. He still to this day is teaching from his home, the last I heard. Anyway, they would say things like, well, it's a private agreement. It's private. Marriage is a private agreement. You don't have to let anybody know about it. I'm sorry, but that simply is not a biblical point of view. It is not a private agreement. It's an agreement, it's a covenant, but it's always a covenant that is declared to others. It is all in what am I doing? I'm isolating from a long study of every single mention of marriage, married, husband, wife, so on, in the Bible. Every single weddings, even the word weddings found, every mention, when you put it all together, it involves those elements. Man and woman with intent to get married. A covenant, a mutual covenant that is made public to third parties in some way. Now the ways vary. See, in the history of in patriarchal times, they would declare third parties, they declare their intent in different ways, such as when Isaac married his wife, when Jacob married his wife. You have them as they come together. There would be family members involved by doing symbolic gestures, the giving of a dowry, which in other words, the woman would take some money that she would inherit from her father, give it to the husband. Well, she's giving it to the marriage. It's brought into the marriage. It's not to the husband. It's given to the marriage. It's for the marriage economically to survive. That's a public thing. It's part of it. Sometimes there would be ceremonies. You could read later on in some of the wisdom literature, like Song of Solomon. You'd read putting on of the veils and special wedding outfits and so on. You get into New Testament times, the ceremonies change, but there's always some kind of ceremony, whether it's very simple or elaborate. I've heard, and I don't know, you've all heard, in some African cultures, they would take a broom and put the broom on the ground, and the couple who's going to get married would jump over the broom. And people laugh about it. You hear that talking about jumping over the broom. But there's nothing funny about that. Why do they jump over the broom? They don't do it in private. They do it so others who are there can see we are formally declaring to the world our intent to be married. The alternative, I got to be careful here because of the class. The alternative is to fill the church and the society with a bunch of LTAs. That stands for living together arrangements, because it comes short of marriage. The intent, a husband and wife, that's good, that's necessary, but it isn't sufficient. I mean, a man and woman. The intent, that's necessary, but it isn't sufficient. What makes it sufficient is have man and woman with the intent, and the third parties are informed. in the way that's expected. Now, if you go out on a limb and you send a letter to the moon or something and think somebody's going to find it planted in one of Elon Musk's rockets if he sends one, and we made our statement and it's up there, that's not what's expected in your country. That's not marriage. Your country, it might be just jumping over the broom, or it might be you go to the courthouse and you secure the proper paperwork, even do a blood test. They used to do that. I don't know if they still require it. And you get permission. Not permission. What I say is you declare through the government channels. That's just what's expected. If that's what's expected, that's how you declare your intent to be married to others. I didn't mean to spend this much time on the definition of marriage, but it's vital, because so much today that passes for it is not. Just two people, even two people in love who are just living together, that's not a marriage.
That's why you have witnesses.
That's the third parties, the witnesses. And it might not involve more than one or two witnesses, a couple at least, I would think. A couple of witnesses, but you declare to the world your intent to be, you declare to others. Again, my point is, contrary to what some of our brethren have taught, well-meaning, maybe some are not so well-meaning. A few I know some were well-meaning. And we correspond a lot. I tried to disabuse them of this idea. I don't know how far I got. I think I made a progress with one of them. He seemed to be coming around on some. But to go into Latin America or go into the world and tell people, you're fine as you're... Why? Why do I bring this up? Because that's what they were already doing in those cultures. Hey, you like me? Yeah, I like you. I think you're pretty good looking. You like me? Yeah, I like you. All right, let's live together. That's what they were doing. And our brethren were saying, oh, well, you love each other? That's fine. That's fine. We'll recognize it in marriage. Wait a minute, brother. You probably haven't thought that through. Let me tell you why I know they didn't think that through. You remember Y2K? Some of you weren't born, but you remember we called it Y2K. What was that? That was the turn of the century, the year 2000. We normally think when we thought there was going to be a horrible computer glitch that didn't pan out. That all the dates would be messed up. Around the year 2000, a lot of people in the world got antsy, and they thought, this is the second millennium, so the Lord might return. I made a trip to Latin America about 3 or 4 months, I think, before the turn of the century. And a friend of mine down there said, Philip, you know what? He knew that I'd harped on this a lot. Did you realize everybody in town's getting married? What do you mean? I'm not making this up. I'm not making it up. Everybody in town, what do you mean? I mean, all the people have been living together, they're getting married. I said, well, what's going on? He said, they think the Lord might return. They want to hedge their bets. I said, They knew all along it was wrong. They knew all along it was wrong. There was a member of the church, a young lady. She had several children. Some of them were grown. They were teenagers. She and her husband, her man Truman, he had an English name, and that's another reason for that. Truman, were living together, and they've been living together for 21 years. And I said to her, sister, she'd been baptized, but there's a legitimate question about whether she had repented before that because of her situation. Anyway, I said, sister, don't you think you and Truman ought to just go ahead and formally get married? She said, no, I'm not sure I'm going to stay with you. I hadn't made up my mind I'm going to stay with him. I want to have a way out. I thought, that doesn't sound like marriage commitment. So I say all that to say, of course, our country's just as bad now. I'm not making fun of Latin America. It's everywhere now. It's everywhere. Nobody even blinks an eye about it. But Jesus does, and the Bible does, and this is why studies like this about the 10 Commandments, these basic moral principles that God put into place, these moral principles have not changed, and we know that because they're brought into the New Covenant, in particular, about the need for the marriage and family and to respect the home and not to destroy the home. And what happens when the home is destroyed? You were talking about the communists. Why would they want to destroy the home? And that's what they were doing. Why destroy the home? What purpose does that serve for their ends? Why would people who are in control in the government, who are wanting power, want to tear down the family?
So they can control everybody.
How's the family get in the way of that? Did I not just give you an example?
Still their morals and their
Yeah, I think hopefully I gave a good illustration of that a while ago, what's happening in this country with our public schools. Parental rights are being denied because the parents want to teach them Bible stuff, right out of the Bible. And the school system is not a Bible-believing system anymore. Well, you have a few teachers, Thank the Lord for a few public school teachers who are brave and they will speak out. But the system itself, overall, claims to be neutral, which in effect means it's atheistic. It's Darwinian evolution and moral relativism. That's what they're pushing all the time. Having kids to define their own values, their own moral beliefs, and not having anybody like a family member to say, God spoke in His Word. He said this or that. That's how we are to live. They are against that. So that's an illustration right there. And if they can destroy parental rights, then since the schools are government schools, the schools belong to the state. They're arms of the state. Public schools belong to the state. I mean, does anybody doubt that point? How could you doubt it? The public schools, by definition, belong to the state. There's an interesting debate I listened to. Some of you go back and listen to these. It was between Nixon and Kennedy. Back, was it 1960? I believe it was 60, wasn't it? The Kennedy-Nixon debate, the first televised debate, presidential debate. It's all black and white. It's old grainy stuff. Now, Richard Nixon, he didn't look he had a 5 o'clock beer or 6 o'clock beer. He didn't look too good. He didn't have any makeup people put anything on him. Kennedy was the dashing debonair as much as you can be as a Kennedy. But anyway, he was all well dressed up with his makeup on. And it was a good debate. I say it's good because of this. Because Nixon said, we've got to be careful. Money that's being sent from the federal government going to public schools in local places, going into to just buy their school buildings, that's freeing up money for them to use for teaching. The money they would have put in their building, now they're buying curricula with that money. And he pointed out to Kennedy. Kennedy tried to say, well, it's just helping the buildings. No, he said, we don't want the federal government in control of the state schools. Sorry, that's a losing battle, Mr. Richard. Long time ago it was lost because the Democrats won on that one. Anyway, even when the states themselves or counties control them, the public schools belong to the government. So that's why I'm saying the school wants to be the surrogate parent. I don't know the answer. I have grandkids in the public schools. I have other nieces and nephews who are being homeschooled. And I certainly see why many parents would be driven to the latter. Eventually, there may not be any choice. In some cases, some of the public schools are pretty good. Like I say, in some communities, they kind of, there are many teachers who will buck the system a little bit, and they'll do what they want to do, and they'll see evolution in the textbooks, but they'll downplay it and let the kids believe what they were taught at Sunday school. But that's getting to be rare these days. Anyway, the home is under attack because Satan wants to destroy it. Because when he does that through the government or whatever else he uses, he can take away our individual freedom, the freedom we're supposed to use to glorify God. That's why we're given our free will we use to magnify our Lord and Savior. They're wanting to take that freedom away and make us slaves to their system. The devil's always wanted to enslave, and he uses governments to do it. Note some blessings on page 90 derive from keeping the fifth commandment. I want you young men especially to think about this. This is written for you. It was written for all of us. We all still have this obligation to our parents. A better world in which to live. If you didn't know who your mother and daddy are, or if you didn't know who your daddy is, and you were growing up in the inner city, and your only friends were just tough guys in the neighborhood, and all they did was get into trouble, and they didn't have a family. Everybody wants a family. They'd form a family, and you call those gangs. They form gang families. But when you have a loving father and mother, that stuff doesn't appeal to you. I don't be a part of that group. Why would I want to be in that? I don't need it. I don't want it. Just think of that simple example, how the home is the foundation of civilization itself. And those who want to destroy civilization know that. This is why they want to destroy the home. When it comes to moral issues, long ago, even back in the early 60s, especially in the later 60s, mid to late 60s, 68 was the turning point. But even prior to that, People like Herbert Marcuse, a German-born Jewish intellectual who was a Marxist, came to this country with the intent of destroying the morality that should reign in the home. Sexual morality. He wanted to destroy that, and he was extremely successful. One old goat. People laughed at him when he moved to Long Beach, California. He and his old goat friends used to dress up suit and ties and go down to the beach. I mean, it tells you everything right there. They're so out of touch. Communism is so out of... They were communists. They came here, and their intent was to get their ideas in all the schools. And, of course, Marcuse wrote a number of books. When the hippie movement came around in the 60s, they would say, Marx and Marcuse. Mao, Marx, and Marcuse. Mao, Marx, and Marcuse. The hippie movement endorsed these three great... Mao is the chairman of Red China, of course. Chairman Mao and Marx, Karl Marx, the founder of the communist movement. And then Marcuse, the one who brought it to the United States. And he said the way to do it is by polyamorous perversity. Polyamorous perversity. Some of you think about word. Poly means many. Amorous has to do with love. I don't have to go into the detail. Polyamorous perversity. At least he was wise enough to realize it is perversity. That's what it is. It's not normal. But he did it on purpose. We'll teach that. Free love. He taught that to the hippie movement. They thought it was just having fun. He knew it was a way to bring down a civilization. The KGB files were open after the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s. And we found their game plan. What we suspected was going on, what people like Joseph McCarthy alleged was going on and had his Senate hearings about. Poor McCarthy was so maligned. But he was right. He may have not have handled everything in the right way, and he had a bad... He wasn't... For some reason they didn't like him, but McCarthy was right when he claimed the communists are infiltrating the State Department. They're infiltrating Hollywood. He didn't know the half. We now know because the KGB files were open and all that information we guessed at was filled in, and we saw this was their game plan. The Soviets wanted to make the United States, which is their biggest enemy, a Marxist nation, and the way to do that is to tear down its Christian ideals, because the opponent to Marxism is Christianity. So what's the best way to tear down Christian ideals? Well, a couple of ways. You can deny God, as you do when you teach evolution. So they did that. But the simplest, most effective, direct, right to the point way is to tell a bunch of young people with raging hormones, hey, you can do what you want. Do whatever you want. And it's all right to do your own thing. And so the hippie movement, we call it, today had deleterious effects that reverberate even down to 2022, nearly 2023. We have never overcome 1968. We can. I heard Pat J. Buchanan in an interview. Some of you remember Pat Buchanan, who was a presidential candidate. He used to work for Nixon in the White House. I think it's one of his press. He wrote speeches for Nixon and later for Reagan. Pat Buchanan is a controversial intellectual, and he said today, the United States doesn't need another Ronald Reagan. Now, here's a friend of Reagan who worked with Reagan. Another Ronald Reagan cannot fix our problems. He said the United States needs an Apostle Paul. Western civilization, not just us, but all of the West, he said, we need another Apostle Paul. What did he mean by that? What do you think he meant, Jesse? What did Paul do in his life that was so spectacular? What did he do for history?
Well, I mean, his influence of his past, being changed, and he was known, but when he was changed on the Damascus Road and obedient, he carried a lot of clout. People gave him opportunity to speak.
Well, what happened with those speeches? The result of his lifetime, historically, what did Paul the Apostle and his traveling companions accomplish? Historically.
He made Christians.
Yeah, but how many? You don't have to give an exact figure, but
The whole world was taught.
Considering how the population, they had a big impact compared to the population of today.
where did he go, by the way? Which regions did he go into his missionary journey? Did he go to India and China on missionary journeys? Where did he go instead? No, he didn't.
Europe.
Asian Europe.
Well, the Asia he went to was what? What is that Asia today? It's the country of Turkey. It's Turkey, which is part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, I'm not saying they're the best members, but Turkey is kind of a part of Europe. And it was the stepping stone in when he was on the western side of Turkey, on the shores of the Aegean. He had a vision. He saw a man, and what did that man ask him to do? You know,
Macedonia.
come on over and do what?
Macedonia.
Help us. Now, where's Macedonia? What's the key about? Why is Macedonia important? Well, it's just north of what famous country? Greece. And what continent is that? Europe. My point is this, and this is historically valid. Western civilization, which is Europe, Northern Europe, and then our forefathers who came to these shores, to Canada, the United States, even you could say broadly, Latin America, all the New World was settled by Europeans. The countries we know today, yes, there were indigenous peoples here, but there were small tribes, they were idolatrous, they were pagan, they didn't accomplish very much. They did. It seems like the evidence is far earlier than the time of the discovery by the Europeans. There had been a huge civilization in Mesoamerica and Central America and in the mountains around that. Well, let's see, it'd be around the Amazon basin, in the jungles of the Amazon. We find ruins there that speak of the fact there was once a major civilization. People who had migrated here from the old world, sons of Noah, one of the sons of Noah, and the descendants had ended up here, brought with them the skills they had learned in the old world. But what I'm saying is, the United States, Canada, and so on, all of Europe is Western. And the West is characterized by a dominant religion for the last 1,500 years until lately. The predominant religion has been Christianity. Now, I know you can argue it's not in its purest form. In most of Europe, you had Roman Catholicism. That's kind of on the margin, but still, it's Christianity compared to Mohammedanism. It's Christianity compared to Islam. Paul the Apostle changed human history. He didn't do it on his own, though. God's Spirit was behind it. The Spirit of the Lord did it, not in a miraculous, mystical kind of way. He revealed these words to people like Paul and his traveling companions. Paul would end up penning a lot of these words, the gospel that he preached. And he went preaching that gospel, changed the world. When Pat Buchanan said in this interview a few years ago, we don't need another Ronald Reagan in our country now. What we need is an Apostle Paul. That resonated with me. I don't know about with you, but it really resonated because I know what he means. He didn't mean literally Paul would come back. He meant we need a religious revival in this culture. That's the only thing it will save us. Politics, he said, it's too late for politics to save us. Because politics will always be corrupt. Whether it's Republican or Democrat, they're going to be corrupt if their heart is not right with God. And they'll use power for their own ends, no matter what they claim when they run. Anyway, a better world in which to live. That was my point. I told you I'd get off sometime. The home is the foundation of civilization. A disrespect for parents will undermine the very foundation of our civilization and culture. I didn't realize, Loretta, that when I was real little and I sassed my daddy back when he told me to do something, that I was undermining Western civilization. But I was. He let me know that right away because he undermined me with usually a switch or a belt. So he nipped that in the bud. But that's the nature of it. I mean, that's why you have parents who love you. So when you grow up, you won't be a hooligan, a hoodlum. You will be a good citizen. Number 2, blessings from keeping the 5th commandment. Honor thy father and mother. It makes for a richer and nobler living. Some kid says, I've always wanted to be noble. Well, what about richer? You can grasp that one, can't you? There is a relationship between right attitudes and right living. The person whose attitude toward parents is right is likely to be a better neighbor and citizen. All this means to say, in a way, you stay out of trouble and you stay happier when you honor your father and your mother. Number 3, it produces happiness in the child. Too many kids today are unhappy. Yeah, I've never seen it. I've never known of it in our country as it is now. And we won't go into all the statistics, but children harming themselves and not liking themselves, just wishing they weren't around anymore. I mean, that's so unnatural for childhood. Should be your best days. But they get this idea when they go to school and they hear teachers say, how did we get into the world? Your parents said from God, but there is no God, the teachers would say. And they're wrong. They're not telling the truth. Hey, Barb, there is no God, the teachers will say. You got here by a sheer accident. The world just popped into being, and then the chemicals that were lying around here just sort of mixed together on their own and eventuated into minor organisms. The first living things came about, and they evolved into others and others. And finally, here we are. No reason to be here. It just happened. And a child children are not dumb. Even young children can figure things out, and they think, well, if that's how we got here, why do I need to do anything? Well, too many kids are seeing that. Well, the answer to that is to show, don't borrow the big lie. Hey, brother, don't adopt the big lie. That's not how we got here. That's not where we came from. We came here from God. The Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the evidence for that, if you're seeking that evidence, is overwhelming and convincing. A child becomes, what happiness, he says, is the result or fruit. It is a product of an obedient, unselfish, and useful life. Trying to get my grandkids yesterday to help my daughter to move. She's moved to a new house. Tried to tell one of my granddaughters, I think she finally got the lesson. They need you. Pick up some stuff and move it. Yeah, but but pick it up and help move it. Even it's too heavy. Get the stuff that's not heavy. She started doing it, and the next thing they know, they went beyond and above and started cleaning things up. And we were real proud of the kids. I was, grandkids. And they were happy. You could see a smile on their face. Why? Well,
She had purpose.
she had some reason, and all kids have purpose. Every individual has a reason to live, purpose. And when we recognize it, then we know we belong and we are wanted, and that's what they call a basic psychological need. To belong and to be wanted. To be needed. To belong and to be wanted. To be needed, in other words. And the older I get, the less needed I feel. So I know how that goes. I just like to be needed. Like I say, help my daughter move. I'd like to be needed, though, with plenty of notice. That's another story, and not all at once. But I don't mind being needed. In fact, it makes life better. And last of all, and we've mentioned this before, the last point, it makes for longevity of life. What does the word longevity mean? Y'all know what longevity is? You hear the word long in it. Longevity. It means longness. It means living long. You want to live long? I do. You know one of the keys to that? The Bible says, honor thy father and thy mother, that it may be well with thee, and listen, thou mayest live long on the earth. And there's the Bible key, longevity. We talked about this before, I won't go into it anymore, is from honoring our parents. Well, we don't have time to review exercises. I'm sorry, I mentioned we'd try to do that. Hopefully we covered it pretty well. Next time it'll be don'ts. And these were the do's. We'll be looking at the don'ts next time in the 10. Any questions or comments? Thank you all for your attention.